Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is David Bagdasarian, and I am a corporate partner in the Charlotte office and co-chair of the firm-wide Disability Inclusion Task Force at K&L Gates. On behalf of the firm-wide Diversity Committee, welcome to our 13th speaker in our Conversations About Race and Diversity series. And on behalf of the entire K&L Gates community, we also welcome our clients who have joined us today for this very important conversation. The firm launched the firm-wide speaker series in June 2020 in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd to have conversations focused on the effects of systemic racism in our society as part of our pledge to listen, be educated, take action, and work together to build a more equitable and inclusive society. We heard from numerous distinguished speakers through this program, including Derek Johnson, President and CEO of the NAACP, Reverend James M. Lawson Jr., civil rights leader, revered teacher, and mentor, and Professor Raj Mohan Gandhi, author, historian, and grandson of Mahatma Gandhi. With the immense success of this program, we broadened our scope in 2022 to encompass diversity and inclusion topics outside of race. We heard from Kevin Jennings, CEO of Lambda Legal, who discussed America's fight for LGBTQ plus equality, and Justice Mary Yu, who spoke about her intersectionality as the first Asian, Latina, and out member of the LGBTQ plus community to serve on the Washington State Supreme Court. Now, in celebration of International Day of Persons with Disabilities 2023, which was observed this past Sunday on December 3, it is my pleasure to welcome our guest, Jill Houghton, President and CEO of Disability In, the leading global nonprofit organization for advancing business disability inclusion and equality. Jill began her career interning for U.S. Senator and disability rights advocate Bob Dole, who was instrumental to the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. She has testified before Congress on issues related to businesses' commitment to recruit, hire, and retain employees with disabilities, and has been featured in Bloomberg, CNBC, Forbes, Fortune, and numerous other media outlets. My co-chair of the firm-wide Disability Inclusion Task Force, Craig Lean, Labor, Employment, and Workplace Safety Partner in our DC office, will moderate today's conversation. Please join me in welcoming Craig and Jill.
Thank you, David. It's such an honor to be here today with Jill to reflect on International Day of Persons with Disabilities. I got to know Jill when I became director of the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs at the U.S. Department of Labor, which I did before I was at K&L Gates. And we had a big focus on disability inclusion and on Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act. And through that work, I got to know Jill almost immediately because she literally is one of the leaders globally in the field of disability inclusion and leads one of the leading organizations. I don't even know if that's enough to say, but one of the certainly the best organizations, one of the most prominent organizations in the world on disability inclusion, which is Disability In. And so, Jill, it's such a pleasure to be here today with you. You're a friend, you're someone I admire, you're someone who I look up to in the disability world, and who helped me when I was director of OFCCP to put together the Section 503 Focused Review Program and to be an advocate for people with disabilities. Thank you for all you do. To begin the conversation today, I wanted to ask you to reflect and tell us about how you got involved in disability advocacy generally, and any thoughts you have on International Day of Persons with Disabilities.
Well, let me just first of all say thank you. Thank you so much for this incredible opportunity. The feeling is quite mutual. You are a leader that has made such important advancements in terms of disability inclusion, and I look up to you. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you.
I think that adage that like life is what happens when you're busy making plans applies to like how I got involved in this, right? Like I have a learning disability and it wasn't anything that I wanted to talk about. I was very embarrassed and kind of felt stupid. And I actually wanted to be a lawyer. And when I went to take the LSAT and I bombed it horribly, we had a family convention of like, what's my plan for my future? And, that's what took me to DC as an intern and really got me started on this journey. But to be honest with you, after I worked on the Hill, I ended up in Indianapolis and I helped a young woman with Down syndrome get a job. And that was like life changing for me because I saw that it wasn't just a job and it wasn't just a paycheck, but that it was about being included and like being a respected member of a community. And I think this young woman, Erica, taught me like why I exist. Um, what does International Day of Persons with Disabilities mean to me? I think what it means to us as a world is that disability is an important part of diversity and that disability is a natural part of the human experience, right? It's a part of diversity that any of us can join the team at any time and that it's beautiful. And quite honestly, at Disability In, we rebranded in 2018. We used to have a name that didn't really convey who we are or what we do. And we rebranded to Disability In because disability is who we are and it's beautiful. And we're working at Disability In to bring business together to advance disability inclusion in the workplace, in the marketplace, in the supply chain. And we got a lot of work to do.
That's very true. Very on the one hand, there's been a lot of progress since the ADA, the Rehabilitation Act. There's been increases in labor force participation, decreases in unemployment for people with disabilities, and yet we still have a very low labor force participation rate for people with disabilities in the 30s compared to in the 60s for the general population. So, your mission is a critical one, and it's something that, we all need to take notice of, all organizations, businesses, our organization, our clients, everyone needs to take note of that. Could you tell us a little bit more about Disability In and the work it has done to advance disability inclusion both domestically and internationally?
So, if you think about Disability In, I'll tell you where we began. We began when the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. I think the people that founded that piece of legislation recognized that you can have all the laws and the regulations in the world, but you can't legislate attitude. And it was really a group of government leaders coming together with a group of business leaders and recognizing that business has the power to create the demand, right? Government has the power to help build the supply, but business can create the demand and business has the power to change the world. So Disability In was really conceived in that light. And we are the place, if you were to close your eyes and think about like who is Disability In, we're the place where talent with disabilities and business intersect. And when I say business, I'm talking large multinational corporations. We started in the US, and everything that we do at Disability In is based on what companies are telling us that they need on this journey. That has now caused us to begin to work outside of the US. But it ranges from things like our benchmarking tool, the Disability Equality Index, to we're the entity that certifies disability-owned businesses, and we're working to help diversify supply chains. To we do a lot of opportunities to convene accessibility leaders or procurement leaders or folks around diversity or mental health or executive sponsors. So, I could go on and on, but we're really that place, and that's the work that we're leading.
Well, you mentioned, let's start with the Disability Equality Index. That's DEI, a different DEI than Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Disability Equality Index. I'm proud to say that K&L Gates participates in the Disability Equality Index, that we were listed as one of the best places to work for disability inclusion. A plug there for our firm. I was very proud of it. Our Disability Inclusion Task Force was a big part of that, and our D&I leadership was a big part of that. And we're planning to continue that from year to year. And I hope other organizations that are on take a look at the Disability Equality Index and think about participating. Could you talk about that? Because that's made a huge impact. I always see your posts when a new company or a new CEO, they get a high score on the Disability Equality Index. One of them joins, and you're always celebrating that. I celebrate it too. I always repost that. Will you talk a little bit about the Disability Equality Index?
Absolutely. And let me just start by saying it means a lot that K&L Gates participated and is a top scoring company, because we don't have enough law firms participating. We're trying to target the AmLaw 200. So, and we're like less than 10. So thank you for being one of the first. But in terms of what is the DEI, so to just give you a little background, people keep knocking on our door, and they have for years, companies, and asking us and firms, where do we get started? What does good look like? How do we identify concrete actions that we can take on our journey? And that really caused Disability In to join forces with another organization called the American Association of People with Disabilities. And we created an advisory council that's co-chaired by Ted Kennedy Jr., along with David Casey, who leads social impact and diversity for Tapestry. And we put together this advisory committee, and they created this tool. And the tool looks at culture and leadership, enterprise-wide access, employment practices, community engagement, supplier diversity, and non-US operations. It has weighted questions, it has non-weighted questions. And for companies or firms that score an 80, a 90, or 100, we celebrate you as the best place to work, recognizing that if you score under an 80, no one will ever know you took it, because it's a carrot and not a stick, right? That being said, I got to call out. So he's since passed away, but you knew Bobby Silverstein, probably one of the greatest disability rights attorneys that there ever was. And when we were creating the DEI, which was, we're getting ready to celebrate 10 years. When we were creating this tool, I went and met with Bobby, and I asked for his guidance. And he gave me, I think, some really wise wisdom, which was, he said, you can come up with the greatest tool in the universe, but if the questions are such that legal will not allow the company to answer or the firm to answer, then your questions were really bad. So we worked to engage people with disabilities, allies, along with attorneys, corporate attorneys, to make sure that we were crafting questions that were actually going to be helpful. So if we fast forward to where we're at today, we have 485 companies participating, 70 of the Fortune 100, nearly half of the Fortune 500. We got a long ways to go. Over the course of the last 2 years, we have piloted a global version of this. And I'm pleased to say that right now, registration is open for our 10th anniversary. And we've opened the DEI in 8 countries. So in addition to the US, you can now participate in the DEI in Brazil, Canada, Germany, India, Japan, the Philippines, and the United Kingdom. So the last thing I'll say to you is this. even if a company or a firm scores 100, we know there is no such thing as perfect. And even the top scoring entities have lots of work to do. And there are a lot of questions that folks answer no to. So we work to do deep dives and to help entities identify more actions that they can take on the journey.
That's so powerful. I feel like the DEI just makes such an impact for organizations. When we became a DEI law firm organization, it helps provide a structure like to our discussions. You look at the different parameters that are in there to get a higher score, and you try to make sure you have those in place and that you're achieving them. It's almost a guide or a checklist to some extent, but the issues on the points that are in the checklist are more than a checklist. They're principles. They're fundamental things you can do as an organization to improve accessibility. So it betters your organization. It's actually something that improves organizations. And I saw, and I know you were a part of this with Disability In, the Accenture report that just came out that emphasizes, and you've always said this, Jill. I've heard you say this probably 100 times, that disability inclusion is the right thing to do. It's the legal thing to do. It's something fundamental, important, but also it is the business thing to do. It's good for business. It's good for productivity. It's good for morale. And now you have this study that proves that in spades. Could you talk about that a little bit?
So what we did, I'll just say to begin with, because people kept asking for the business case. Not every industry, but a lot of industries want to know, like, what's the business case? And so we teamed with Accenture. Initially, we teamed together in 2018, and we took the first 5 years of data and produced something called the Disability Inclusion Advantage, Getting to Equal. Most recently, just within the last 2 weeks, we released the newest update to this business case, and it's called the Disability Inclusion Imperative. And I'll tell you what we found is that the business case only improved. So specifically for the companies that were really leading on disability inclusion, we found that they had 1.6 greater revenue, 2.6 times more net income, and 2 times more economic profit. So it really, it pays to be disability inclusive. And I will tell you that with these business cases, we took these business cases to investors. So we went to Comptroller DiNapoli from New York State. We've gone to the treasurer of Massachusetts, the treasurer of Oregon, the Ethical Partners Fund in Australia. The list goes on. And we've got 32 investors and growing that represent $2.8 trillion in assets under management that are calling on the companies that they invest in to really get started on this journey to prioritize disability inclusion and to utilize tools like the Disability Equality Index to, what gets measured matters, and to take action.
It's wonderful. So, for everyone listening, take a look at Disability In's website, look at the Disability Equality Index, think about doing that for your organization. Reach out to Jill, reach out to me. These are things that you should do. They're helpful to your organization. And, we may touch on the index more as we talk. But let me change gears a little bit. I wanted to ask you more about disability itself. So as a disability advocate, as someone with a disability, what are some common misconceptions people have about disability? How do these misconceptions contribute to less accessibility and inclusion? And do you have any examples or anecdotes or stories you'd like to share?
So, I think that the misconception, and there are many, is that when people think about disability, they generally think about what people can't do. And as it relates to employment and it relates to business, it goes a step further and they're thinking about like, what's this going to cost? Um, you know, uh, we can't afford to accommodate people. And so, I'll tell you some stories. I'll tell you a story. It's a powerful story about a woman who is our immediate past chair on our board, um, who's deaf. And years ago, when she was interviewing at a very large tech company, she faked that she could hear because she was afraid that if they knew she was deaf, she wouldn't get the job, right? So she gets the job and she's working there. And as you can imagine, she's in meetings and she's not picking up everything that's being said because she's reading lips, but there's a lot of people talking at once. And so it's not going well. And she's about ready to get probably fired. So she's got to come to this place where she's got to realize, is she going to uh, choose to identify, to share that she's deaf and to ask for the accommodation that she needs. And as luck would have it, she was working with an HR business partner that really helped her on the journey. So she comes out, she tells him she's deaf, she tells him she needs a sign language interpreter, and they provide her with the accommodation that she needs. Now, if we fast forward to today, this person is now one of the world's only chief accessibility officers at one of the world's largest tech companies, and she's leading accessibility in all of their products, in all of their services, in their work inside and in their work outside. And I tell you this story because when I tell this story, and I recently shared this story at this thing that we were at called Governance Week, where we were in this like small environment with like corporate board members from, the who's who of corporate America, along with some of the world's largest investors. And this very powerful person in the room came up and said, I can't leave this room without speaking my truth. And he said, I'm deaf. And he said, I put Google Meet on my phone so that I can turn it on and I can read the captions and know what people are saying. And I haven't ever told anybody that I'm deaf. And so, there are many misconceptions, and we have a lot of work to do on this journey. But when we open this dialogue and begin to share our stories and have these kind of opportunities like you're hosting here with K&L Gates, we're creating that space where we can begin to think about what people can do and what we can do, what our role is in our companies to help ensure accessibility and inclusion for everybody.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that story. Self-identification is so important that someone can be themselves at work, that they can disclose their disability if they wish, that they can seek an accommodation that's helpful to them, that they know they're in a place where they're safe to do that and will receive support. Thank you for sharing that story. And those are organizations that we want to be abundant, to be everywhere. That's the goal. And you do so much as an organization and you as a leader to help achieve that. So let me ask you, let's go back 30 years to the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, celebrated its 30th anniversary in 2020. And so, 1990, we're talking about. It's now a part of everyday life in the US. And in fact, there was the ADA Amendments Act to broaden it. After some judicial interpretations interpreted it narrowly. There was Congress acted again, did it broadly. Both of those are famously bipartisan as well. You mentioned Senator Dole, you mentioned Ted Kennedy Jr., and obviously Senator Kennedy. You're talking about two major Democratic and Republican senators. Disability is something that's always been bipartisan, addressing it. So now you have the ADA applying in education, employment, recreation, transportation, housing, government services. So I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on the recent anniversary and about your work helping organizations comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act.
You know, while so much has been accomplished, right? I mean, there are such great strides that have occurred over the years. We have so much work to do. And in the preamble of the ADA, it talks about people with disabilities, and it talks about people with disabilities being a minority group that has been subjected to a history of unequal treatment, right?
Yes.
An insular group that's been marginalized. And the reality is that while we've made such great strides, we have so much more work to do. And really, I think we have so much more work to do when it comes to uh, economic opportunity, when it comes to the employment and the unemployment and the underemployment of people with disabilities. And so, that's what we're really laser focused on at Disability In. I think that how we get at that and the work that we have to do is, monumental. One of the things that we have done is taken a page out of other areas of diversity. So, for example, we know that if we look at gender, that there has been a lot of work around um, the retention and advancement of women in the workplace. And there has been a lot of work at the governance level of uh, getting towards gender parity, right? And while there's a lot more work to do, great strides have been made. And so at Disability In, we've really taken a page out of other areas of diversity. And so, for example, we've studied the definition of disability or diversity in the stock exchanges around the globe to see, does disability show up? And we see it shows up in the UK, and we see it shows up in Toronto in the stock exchange, but it's widely missing. And so we've launched an initiative called Boards Are In, and we're looking at not only these definitions, but we're calling on the companies that we work with in your NomGov charters to add disability to your definition of diversity. So right now we're tracking like 14 companies
That's great.
that have added that comma and added the word disability so that disability shows up at the top of the house in addition to the entry level.
That's really powerful. I'm so glad that you're doing that. I'm a disability advocate. And also advise companies on their diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility programs, environmental, social governance programs. Our firm does a lot of that too, advising in those areas. And one stat that always sticks out to me, and it was in the Harvard Business Review, was that only 4% of DEI programs include disability. Almost all of them include race and ethnicity. Almost all of them include gender, but very few include disability. And so one thing I've advocated is that, they include LGBTQ plus status, that they include disability status, that they include veterans, that they include religion, that they include other groups. Can you talk a little bit about, are you seeing progress there? Like what can be done to help companies realize that they need to include disability in their DEI program? One thing I'd recommend is include DEI in your DEI program, the Disability Equality Index. That's a great way to bring disability in. Could you talk a little bit about that?
So we like to say if you're not including disability in your diversity efforts, right, then you're not leading inclusively. So people with disabilities really are that missing piece in the conversation. And like we talked about in the beginning today, disability doesn't discriminate, right? It's an area of diversity that anyone can join at any time. I mean, my husband was an able-bodied individual and was riding a motorcycle and hit a palm tree, right? So now he uses a wheelchair. He wasn't born like that, so he joined the team. Our board chair was the general counsel at Accenture and was in a motorcycle accident and lost his leg. He joined the team. He's an amputee. So, you know, in terms of disability inclusion, it's a significant opportunity. And I think the greatest resource that companies have to do this work are your people, like looking inside in your people. So when you and David are the co-chairs of your D&I committee at K&L Gates, um, you know, looking inside your company or your firm, and do you have a disability employee resource group? And if the answer is yes, then I think engaging your people on your journey and working to ensure that disability becomes part of your DEI programs.
So that brings me then to the Rehabilitation Act. It's celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. The Rehabilitation Act includes Section 503, which of course relates to federal contractors and federal contractors having affirmative action for people with disabilities, and also best practices to try to recruit and retain people with disabilities. And under Section 503, there's even a 7% goal that every organization that's a federal contractor have at least 7% of their workforce. It's called a utilization rate, but 7% of their workforce, both generally and in every job group, be at least 7% people with disabilities. And of course, a lot of that is recruiting, and a lot of that is also making people feel comfortable to self-identify. Can you reflect a little bit on the Rehabilitation Act, its impact, and what you're doing as Disability In to help companies meet those goals if they're federal contractors, and even if they're not?
It's interesting because we always talk about going above, right? Going above and beyond the law. And yet, obviously, the Rehabilitation Act and was a landmark piece of legislation. And when like Section 503 was modernized, and then you were in office and rolled out the focused review program, I mean, those actions, again, bipartisan, were monumental in terms of bringing companies to the table to really engage in this hard work. So, and it is hard work. I mean, you're the self-ID piece, right? Like, people fear coming out. Workers fear that if they come out and they share their disability, that it's gonna damage their career, right? In fact, it wasn't that long ago that I was working with a different firm, a very large multinational firm, and one of their, most senior partners in the firm was losing his vision and didn't want to come out, didn't want to ask for the accommodation or the productivity tools that he needed to do the job because, he feared that the firm would believe that, he wasn't capable of leading. And in that instance, it was so real. He actually retired. He stepped down and chose not to disclose his disability. And it's very much a personal choice, right? We tell people it's a personal choice, but what we're trying to do at Disability In with tools like the Disability Equality Index is work with companies and work with firms to create that environment where people can be authentic and come out and ask for what they need, and that their manager knows how to provide them what they need, right? And and we can continue to grow these numbers. But we've got a lot of work to do. I mean, in the DEI, what the DEI tells us is that about 4.6% of the existing workforce of the participating companies in the DEI, of the 485 companies, that it's around 4.6% who openly identify as being disabled.
It's an interesting point because that 7% goal is interesting because the statistics, the census, all that seems to indicate that maybe a quarter of the population has a disability. And that's probably within somewhat narrow definition of disability. If you really take the broad definition and look at OFCCP publishes a self-identification form, which you're well aware of, and it lists all the different disabilities there are and includes, for the first time, they recently released it again. And I had a little part to play in this when I was OFCCP director, but they included neurodivergence for the first time. And I remember looking at that form myself and realizing, things that I had thought were conditions, medical conditions, a couple non-apparent ones I have, were on the list. And I'm like, well, I should be self-identifying. And so I started self-identifying. Take a look at that list, everyone, if you get a chance. It's just, you can look it up on a web browser, just put in OFCCP self-identification form. But what you begin to realize when you see all the different non-apparent disabilities there are, is that everyone, at some point, almost everyone, or maybe everyone, at some point in their life, will likely have either a permanent or temporary disability when you look at how broad the list is. And yet, and like you said before, it's a group that anyone can become part of at any time. And so, that's why I think it's so important to have people be able to self-identify and feel comfortable self-identifying so they can get the accommodations they need. I'll just tell you, Joe, one of the conditions I saw on the list was migraines. I've had chronic migraines since I was a kid, and I was hospitalized a couple times when I was younger. And you know what? They pop up. I get visual distortions, and as I get pain, and I'm a partner at a law firm, so I can take a break, I can rest. I control my schedule, but a lot of people don't. And so disclosing that and being able to get an accommodation where you can take a rest or take a break or go home, that's incredibly important. And that people feel comfortable doing that and not try to hide it. And you mentioned a couple where, your anecdotes where people had to decide whether they wanted to remain in the workforce. And, so I'm so grateful for what you're doing as Disability In to try to get more people to self-identify, more companies to be more comfortable, to make a work atmosphere where people are more comfortable to self-identify. Thank you for sharing those stories. I think they're very powerful.
Can I just piggyback?
Yeah, of course.
This is anecdotal, but one of the key things that we think that companies need to do is to make the accommodations policy out there, have it be known. It's a key ingredient. And we see kind of time and time again that it's not out there. And I don't know why that is. I don't know if people are afraid, if we put the policy out there, then people are going to use it and it's going to cost us money. I don't know what it is. But when you make the policy widely known and maybe even connect it to the work of your ERG, your employee resource group, and then educate your managers about how to who pays, who pays for the accommodation and how to help your new candidates or existing workforce get the accommodation that they need, and make sure that your people know how to request an accommodation. That's a key part of this whole equation towards really making the workforce inclusive.
100% agree. And one other thing you mentioned was affinity groups. And at OFCCP, we put together a list of Section 503 best practices. And now when I advise companies, I often cite to that and talk about it. And I'm hoping it gets expanded, these best practices. But you mentioned affinity groups. That's a big one. We have our Disability Inclusion Task Force at K&L Gates, which is an employee resource group. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, affinity groups or employee resource groups, how that can help benefit people with disabilities?
So, some of the key ingredients we saw a better predictor of success than all of the legal frameworks out there is if you have C-suite support, you have an executive sponsor who either openly identifies as being disabled, like yourself, or is a strong ally, perhaps a family member, along with your ERG. And, you know, in terms of how you work with your employee resource group, I think really like moving beyond the building awareness to really attaching it to the work, the business. So I think about a financial services institution that I was with recently, and you know they took their disability equality index. They took the meat of it, and they brought together senior leaders from real estate, from marketing, from technology, from talent acquisition. You know, they brought all the powers that be, and they mapped out a 3-year strategy in partnership with their employee resource group and really attached the work of the employee resource group to the business.
Yeah.
And are holding themselves accountable, right? What gets measured matters. And on top of that, celebrating. You know, I think that there is power in engaging your employee resource group.
Yes, I agree. And I'll tell you one other story briefly that I think you'll like from OSCCP. When I was OSCCP director, I looked at your DEI and some of your these goals and trying to get more people to seek accommodations and disclose. And so I did a campaign at OFCCP, and I did a whole video with our Civil Rights Center. We posted it online for companies, similar to what you do with the CEOs who make a statement in favor of disability inclusion. So thank you for that. And I want to tell you, when I was doing it, I was told, well, you know, when you do this, more people may ask for an accommodation. I'm like, well, that's the point. Because people don't realize that accommodations, you know, increase productivity by definition. And that accommodations, the average accommodation, or over 50% of accommodations have zero cost. That's what the Office of Disability Employment Policy says. And of those that have a cost, the average is $500. And so, you know, which is a drop in the bucket when you're talking about someone's career and their productivity. So, you know, I'm trying to get companies to think more broadly about that. Would you like to comment on that? Because you started a lot of this at Disability Inn, getting companies to think this way.
You know, it's true. You're right. Accommodations are not expensive. You know, generally speaking, research says, right, they're less than $500, and in the most part, probably don't cost anything. So I think it's false evidence appearing real. You know, that fear, right? And at Little Old Disability Inn, we just did our own self ID campaign and got 100% of our own workforce to participate in our self ID campaign, and we spend, you know, the majority of our team is disabled, and I will tell you, what they accomplish is powerful all around the globe. And what we spend on accommodations is minimal. You know, it pays to be inclusive.
It does. And, you know, when you think about mental health and the neurodivergent disabilities, the mental health, psychiatric disabilities, and you start looking at anxiety, depression, there was a study a few years ago that said that 60% of attorneys at some point in their career have anxiety, depression, ADHD. You know, ADHD is a little different because that you may have your whole life. But the point is, at some point in their career, they have one of these disabilities. And yet, when you look at the NALP study, the association that looks at law firm and law firm placement, they say that only about 0.5% of attorneys have a disability. And I thought right there, oh my goodness, you know, over 60% have conditions that would be considered disabilities, but so few people self-identify. And I was trying to figure that out. And then we had a panel of law students that I was part of. And they said, look, we don't want to disclose a disability that relates to our mind because we're worried about stereotypes or stigmas. But what that means is they don't get the accommodations they need or the support in the workplace. And it ends up almost being a self-fulfilling point that they end up having difficulty in the workplace because they couldn't make the accommodation request or the self-ID. So this mission is so important to help people self-ID, I believe. But any final words before we move to the next subject on this? This is a critical point. I know that Disability Inn has led on this and nationally.
You know, it's just it's a challenge. And I do think that one of the key ingredients is getting senior leaders in the firm, in companies, to embrace the opportunity to come out. I think about a very large Fortune 100 company where the CEO, in their self ID campaign, wanted to come out and wanted to share his disability. And the lawyers were deeply concerned because they were afraid that it would have a negative impact on their stock. So they were advising him against coming out and identifying that he had a disability. It was a learning disability. In the end, I'm happy to share that he did come out and share his learning disability, and it did not have a negative impact on their stock. But it did have a positive impact on their culture and on their company. And so, as you're working on this journey, if you're a senior leader in your firm, in your company, and you're listening, and you have a disability, you have an opportunity to really have a significant impact on the inclusion of people with disabilities in your company. And, when you lead inclusively, it leads to better products and services for everybody. I'll leave you with one last example, and then I'll let you. I was listening to a very, very large, one of the largest companies in the world talk. I was listening to some blind leaders talk from this company recently, and they were sharing a story about how they gave two examples. On their platform, you use stars and bars, and the stars and bars were not, the color contrast wasn't accessible. And so they piloted making it accessible. And they had instant increase in the use of that tool, and that leads to more dollars on their platform. And so it was something that was driven by these blind leaders, but it actually had an impact on the company for everybody. And then the last example that they used that I thought was really cool was this blind leader went into one of their fulfillment centers, and when they're doing the checking of boxing and unboxing their products, you have to click a mouse. That's the task. And when the blind leader went to do that, she said, she couldn't see. So she was like, I couldn't do that. So I just went, control, function, whatever. And the person that could see was like, oh my gosh, I spend so many seconds trying to get that mouse in the right place. And you just went click, click. And so it had an impact on their business. And now they don't do the mouse and the button, but they do the buttons, click, click. And I just thought that was a really cool example of how inclusion had an impact on the business, and how, it wasn't just for people with disabilities, it's for everybody.
It definitely is. Those are great examples. Let me ask you about neurodiversity in the workplace. I wanted to make sure we talked about that a little bit. So, neurodiversity has become a big focus in the United States. In many ways, it started with autism, and then, neurodiversity is broader than autism. It applies to autism, it applies to ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, a number of other conditions and disabilities. And, there's a movement toward including people who are neurodivergent and recognizing that is a part of diversity, and that there are strengths that come from neurodivergence. Sometimes there's challenges, which is why there are disabilities, and that there's accommodations related to them. My daughter, as you know, is autistic and has an intellectual disability. And, so that's part of what brought me into this, the disability community as an advocate. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because you mentioned a point earlier. You said, which resonated with me. You said, you have to get the general counsel to support these sort of programs. And one thing I used to hear when I was at OFCCP was, oh, well, you want to have all these disability focused programs, disability hiring programs, neurodiversity in the workplace programs, but is that really allowed? Is that because a lot of times when people think of the ADA, they think about confidentiality, they think about not having these sort of public programs, and I would, you remember this, Disability In published on this, OFCCP did, the EOC has now, they have a whole webpage about this, but no, 100%, you can do these programs for the benefit of people with disabilities, and you can focus on neurodivergence, for example. Can you talk a little bit about neurodiversity in the workplace? Because when I talk to clients, they bring it up a lot. I'm asked to speak a lot about it. You must be getting the same sort of requests. Any thoughts about neurodiversity in the workplace and where that's going and what Disability In is doing in that area?
So it's hot. It's really hot. And I think that what we know statistically is that we know that 1 out of every 8 people around the globe may be neurodivergent. And so what that means is that many of these people, right, are in our workforce today. And if they're not, they could be. And that they possess valuable, hard to find qualities, but that maybe they aren't going to come in through the typical channels that we use. So what we're seeing is we're seeing companies like EY and SAP and Dell and Microsoft and JP Morgan, and the list goes on and on and on, who are coming at this in different ways to create, initially, sometimes it's an autism at work, sometimes it's a neurodiversity at work, and then ultimately to use these programs to look at their policies, to look at their practices, and to modify how they're getting people in the door and keeping people. So perhaps rather than using the testing, the behavioral testing, and the way that they've gone around interviewing, modifying that to be more of an interactive experience over the course of a week or over the course of 2 weeks to get to know talent and candidates in a different way and to help onboard them and get them in the door. I think about people like, I'll tell you a story about this young man named Deepak, who is one of our next gen leaders, which is a program of college kids, recent graduates with disabilities. Deepak went to school at University of Washington, got a degree in software engineering, and set out to find himself a job, and wasn't having any success. And the more rejection he faced, the worse he felt about himself, and the more likely he was to turn around and go back to school and keep getting degrees and still not have a job. I met Deepak. He was at one of our conferences and he was somewhat overwhelmed because there's like all this action. We have a neurodiversity at work employers roundtable, comprised of these companies that are on this journey. And they have something called the Career Connector, where they're putting these jobs out that they're trying to attract neurodiverse talent for. And I thought, well, this is a test because I wonder if this really works. So Deepak got on to the Career Connector and he ended up finding a job at Optum Healthcare in Minnesota and he got hired. So I was like, yes, success. So it is a hot topic. There's a lot of work going on in this space. And I would encourage folks to get in contact with your peers and learn about what they're doing. Connect with companies like EY who have neurodiversity centers of excellence all over the globe.
And one person that can do that in an organization is a chief accessibility officer. So, and we were talking earlier about chief accessibility officers. You mentioned an example. And can we talk about that a little bit too? Because I see more organizations having chief accessibility officers. I've advocated for, when I was at OFCCP and then with some of the boards I serve on, for a chief accessibility officer of the United States. Hopefully that'll happen one day. Canada has a chief accessibility officer. I was on a panel with her, Stephanie Cadieux. Jenny Leigh Fleury is, was one of the first chief accessibility officers at Microsoft, extremely well known and an advocate and a model for me. I've tried to be more like her and her leadership. And so for organizations that might want to have a chief accessibility officer, what would you tell them or thinking about it?
So I would say a couple things. I'd say that accessibility is your people's like ticket to play, right? Is that regardless of who you are or how you represent, you need access to participate. And if you're thinking about building out accessibility, number one, you want to engage with your disability employee resource group, right? Like engage with your people. Number two, I'd encourage you to seek out people like Jenny Leigh Fleury and benchmark. You can come to Disability In and we will connect you with accessibility leaders. We have an accessibility leadership committee. We have our own chief accessibility officer, Jeff Whistle, who came to us from the financial services world, where he led accessibility. And connect with your peers and learn about what they're doing. Every company kind of is going about it differently. Microsoft has more of a hub and spoke model and is building it and making accessibility part of everybody's job. Whereas some folks, sit accessibility in a specific department. We're big fans of the hub and spoke model. But again, encourage you to work with your peers and happy to connect you with your peers.
Yes, and please say hi to Jeff for me. When we talked to Stephanie Kajush, Jeff was on the panel too, and what an exceptional chief accessibility officer. Anyone out there listening, you may want to reach out to Jeff because he is a chief accessibility officer and he's extremely generous with that and helping people to develop that. So think about it. And certainly with your DEI programs, add the A for accessibility and include disability as we both talked about today. I wanted to give you, we're nearing the end of the conversation, Jill. This has been a pleasure. We could definitely talk another hour. I enjoyed your anecdotes. You're such a tremendous leader. I wanted to give you an opportunity for the next 3 or 4 minutes to just close by reflecting on the impact of the ADA and Rehabilitation Act in the US and globally, and through similar laws, and include what best practices can be done to help achieve goals for organizations. But really, this is your time. What would you want to tell everybody? We have a big audience, a lot of organizations that are trying to do more in the disability area. What would you tell them?
I would say that personally, I'm a big fan of you get what you measure. And disability should be part of your metrics across the business. So your workforce representation, your accessibility, your procurement, working to include disability metrics. Utilize the Disability Equality Index to help develop your metrics. And then I think even more so than what you measure, it's what you get, what you celebrate. So, that's what's fun and powerful. So celebrate your success and celebrate it with your people. Your people are your greatest resource, and disability is a beautiful part of the human experience. So engage with your disability employee resource group and celebrate and use these days, these moments like International Day of Persons with Disabilities or Global Accessibility Awareness Day in May, or Disability Employment Awareness Month in October. Celebrate it 365 days a year.
Well said. That's exactly right. Thank you, Jill. It's been such an honor and pleasure to talk to you today. Thank you for all you do for people with disabilities and for businesses across the United States and globally. We're so grateful to you. And thank you for being here today with us. And so that concludes our conversation about race and diversity. I did want to say one last thing. I always like to say this, said it last year. K&L Gates cares deeply about disability inclusion. I just like to mention one of our former partners, Dick Thornburg, who passed away a few years ago. I know you know him, Jill. the former Attorney General of the Unidited States. He was a big part of the ADA, and that's one of the reasons. In addition to the fact it's so important to have these discussions, but one of the reasons we like to focus on disability and remember what Dick did and what he achieved, and that's part of the legacy of our firm, and we want to bring that to others as well. So I wanted to mention him, and Jill, thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful
Thank
day.
you.
Thank you everyone for joining us. Have a great day.